Welcome back. Thank you for joining me again. Thank you for joining Kim and Zande. We're here again, continuing the reading of There's Something You Should Know About Leroy. The last video ended in the middle of chapter 11. So I'm actually going to pick up from there, right? So reading, continuing chapter 11. The powerful smell of the fogging had just about faded. The asthmatics were on their way to recovery. The mosquitoes were covering their mouths and giggling, slapping their skinny legs and telling stories of narrow escapes. It had gotten very dark and the streetlights were all on. One by one, the unofficial members of Portmore's underbelly were slowly shaking off the reverie of their daytime slumber and were emerging to claim the streets. They were nocturnal. They came out when others sought refuge on the inside for the same reason. They were the reason. They were the ones who surveyed the scheme, checking the length of the chain for the weakest links, tugging and prying to come back later. They knew which ones to steal and which cars to steal and which cars to let alone. The car insurance rates for Portmore dwellers were many times higher than for those who lived even in the capital city. Portmore vehicles were that more vulnerable to theft. It seemed not to matter that many of those vehicles were heavily fortified with steering locks and alarms that went off every time a dog strutted by. They knew which houses were vacant, whose occupants had gone abroad or were on vacation. They knew which houses contained strong, defiant men who wouldn't go down without a fight, which houses had weak, wimpy men who posed no threat, which houses had no men at all. The latter were in the majority. They knew which houses were grilled and which were not, who stayed out late and who locked up earlier, which neighbors were vigilant and which ones seemed not to be aware of their vulnerability. They went into full gear mainly at night, and most times, not always, they sought the weakest. Prue, walk with me down to the supermarket, said Greg. He hoped she would say yes. Greg made a quick glance at Leroy's face to check for signs of objection. There were. Leroy hardly spoke, but everyone knew his thoughts ran deep. Leroy didn't like the idea. His face revealed it. Greg smiled to himself. At this hour, asked Prudence, I thought you were off today anyway. I'm off, but I need to go collect my paycheck. They've been giving me the runaround all week. If I want to catch the manager, these are the hours I have to go. Sure, said Prudence. She jumped from the wall and landed on the grass in the swale. Catch you tomorrow, guys, she said to the others. They all drifted indoors. Prudence didn't mind walking in the cool night air. In fact, she enjoyed it. She would have preferred to be walking with Leroy rather than Greg, but a friend was a friend. She never felt afraid of walking through the scheme, no matter what the hour. She was not a fearful person generally. She had been warned that she allowed her artistic freedom to spill over into the real world, where the rules were different and the consequences more severe. But to Prudence, freedom was freedom. A woman was free to lie nude and unashamed in a room full of people, and she had the freedom to walk through the scheme late at night with a man she had no intimate feelings for, to gauge the reaction of a man she secretly adored. Freedom was freedom. At that hour, the supermarket was empty. The aisles were vacant and there were no queues by the checkout points, just last-minute shoppers sprinkled here and there, picking up a few necessities before heading home. In fact, only 2 cashiers were at their posts and very idle. The real crowd came in between 5 and 7, unless it was a weekend or the eve of a major holiday or a hurricane was approaching. Then the aisles were jam-packed, the checkout lanes endless, and all the trolleys and shopping baskets were taken. Greg enjoyed his job at the supermarket, and that, according to his mother, was his biggest problem. He had no ambition. He was a bagger. He stood at the checkout counter and packed grocery into bags. He was very serious about his job. There was a science to it, which most people took for granted. You couldn't pack any old thing with any old other thing. There was a method, an elaborate system of steps to follow. You wouldn't understand. Greg prided himself on being able to pack a bag so neatly that no one ever came back to complain of anything being squashed, burst, torn, or dented. No eggs ever got cracked. He knew what to do with eggs. He wrapped them neatly with paper and placed them lovingly into the shopper's arms. Breakables, he took the time to wrap carefully and singularly. Nobody ever came back with a broken glass. Not on his watch. There were other baggers who hid grocery under the mass of bags on the counter to retrieve after the shopper had left. Not Greg. No one ever came back to complain that goods had turned up missing. At least get a job around the back of in the storage room, or get some training and be a cashier. You can't just be content to be a bagger, his mother complained. But Greg loved his job. When there was no queue, he would sometimes walk along the aisle and try to nab a shoplifter in the act. It had happened a couple times. Shoplifters were rampant. Some just came in, pulled the pockets of whatever they wanted, and filled their guts on spot. Never mind that there were surveillance cameras at every vantage point. Who has time to watch those stupid videos anyway? The thieves seemed to reason. The security guard who was posted in the supermarket tended to focus his attention towards the front of the store, near the points of exit. Greg could teach him a thing or two. The thieves stayed towards the back and had a picnic then, walls out, very satiated. Many times, Greg had discovered many packets of food, half-eaten packs of grapes, bread and bun that had been pulled and broken and deserted on the shelves. Maybe he could get some training and become a security guard. He would do well at it. The manager wasn't in. He knew they would be lay-waiting him, and they had taken a detour. Damn, so much heartache just to get a little pittance. He was upset, but then he remembered that Prudence was waiting outside for him. Manager not here. One of those things, he said. Prudence shrugged. She understood. This was exactly the type of thing that would not happen to her after she made her millions. Godfrey would be the type of manager who really did care. All her taxes would be filed on time and she would never go bankrupt. They walked back down through the scheme towards home, about a mile away. Greater Portmore sprawled ahead of them in the semi-darkness. The scheme was still busy. Men and boys were on bicycles, riding about. Some cars were just pulling in, some pulling out. People were unloading bags and boxes from the trunks of station wagons. A few SUVs were parked, indicating the upward mobility of Portmore's residents. Some of the earlier residents who had come into some affluence had in fact moved out, terrified of the direction in which Portmore might be headed. Those who could afford it bought a lot and fled to the hills of Hellshire and turned up their noses as they sped by each morning on the way into Kingston. Others, dreading the influx of expatriates from the slums of neighboring Kingston and Spanish Town and the wave of crime that was sweeping the municipality, opted to stay and ride it out. But they did so by purchasing a townhouse in one of the handful of upscale, gated communities that had started to pop up. Despite the news of bodies being washed up here or a store being looted there, of taxi drivers being ambushed, robbed, kidnapped and sometimes killed, of young girls going missing, and of women being raped at gunpoint, the residents of Portmore went about their affairs, some seemingly oblivious. They kept up their houses and gardens, they dropped their children off to school or saw them off on the bus. Some of these children were latchkey urchins because their parents had no choice. They worked too far away. But still, these children got bicycles or video games at Christmas time. Their parents painted the houses and strung up Christmas decorations. They tried to muster the morale. They wanted their town to pass the worst. A lady was having driving lessons in a hiace van, dutifully labeled with 2 huge L's. She was trying to reverse. Greg held on to Prudence and eased her out of the way. I thought Leroy would say something about me asking you to come. Say something? Leroy is not my father. I know, but I thought he was your man. My man? There's a tone you speak in when you try to pretend that you don't have a clue when someone is talking about what someone is talking about. That tone. Come on, Prue, I've known you for years, and I've never been able to tell you. Are you two sleeping together or not? You know I'm in love with you, but I can't keep stringing along like this. Tell me if I should back off. Back off. They both burst out laughing, though each had serious concerns. He had been surprised that Leroy hadn't objected, and she had been disappointed. Hurt even. She dared not admit to him that she herself was confused about Leroy. His reaction towards her was bland, ambiguous at best. He had sat for countless hours staring at her body as she lay wearing nothing but a desire, and she seemed to have none in return. He seemed to have none in return. She inspired in him nothing more than blobs and blotches. While Greg dribbled and doted, Leroy was aloof. She would switch the one for the other any day. She crossed the main road and immediately saw that there was some commotion by the bar, which was still a few blocks away. Inspector Lloyd was in the red of things, as he always was. His sirens were still blaring and his lights flashing. A crowd had gathered but were being kept at bay by 4 policemen who had accompanied the inspector. 2 men had been handcuffed. Pauline was hysterical, professing her innocence. What happened? Asked Greg, to no one in particular. They found 2 guns in the bar, under the counter. 2 big everlasting guns, someone explained. So things are heating up in this community. Huh? Alright, that's the end of chapter 11. So I'm going now to chapter 12. The residents of Greater Portmore may have owned their houses or paid their rent, but it was the cats who were really in charge. Not even the dogs could do anything without the cat's permission. Cats are kings, dogs are slaves, Stubbs would say. He didn't own a cat per se, but he harbored them, and if you had plans to hurt any of them, you had to go through him. Well, through him and his wheelchair. He sent people to buy the fancy cat food that came in packets and tins with pretty labels, and he gave them a proper mouthful when they told him he was being extravagant. It wasn't as if the cats cared much who was footing the bill for their feed. They bossed Stubbs around just like they did everyone else. But they condescended to sit on his lap and let him stroke them, sometimes. It all depended on the mood they were in. There were no appointments. You had just to check in and see if they could accommodate you or not. There were about 5 cats who frequented this particular house, but there were others who claimed their turf elsewhere along the walkway. When a dog and a cat passed each other, the dog cowered and said, "Good morning," and the cat said, "You're welcome." Is that so, Kim Kim? Is that how cats behave towards you? I hope not. I hope not. If he still had legs, Tubbs reckoned he would use them to kick mongrel dogs. He had never done so before, but lately was feeling so inclined. The entire scheme was teeming with dogs, the result of casual trysts and one-night stands, a bewildering melting pot of breeds and traits. Some were claimed, but most were ramblers, roaming as impromptu packs and driving terror into the hearts of women and children, and being a nuisance to the men in uniforms. And some of them did bite, and there were no owner to foot the doctor bill. There was no owner to foot the doctor bill. It was one of the issues Stubbs had tried to address as president of the Citizens Association. People were being bitten while going about their legitimate affairs, with no one to stand responsibility. Stubbs had lobbied for the strays to be rounded up and pounded, at least neutered to stem their proliferation. A few dozen had been garnered and some media attention given to the plight of the residents. But that had been that. The mongrels still roamed at large, some carrying grouses. Maud didn't mind the cats as long as they went outside to do their business, which most of them did. Prudence had taken the liberty to name the cats, but none of them responded to the names, since no one had consulted them on the matter. Stubbs had 2 cats now in his lap, stroking, and he was talking with Indian, his best friend, who lived down the road. They talked a lot about relevant issues, local, international, and otherworldly. Stubbs was 62 years old, Indian 2 years his senior. Stubbs declared himself to be the brains of the outfit. To his face, and quite often, Stubbs said that Indian had almost been born an idiot. Missed it by this much. He had come out as half idiot, which was sometimes just as bad. Indian said that if he was half idiot, Stubbs was a quarter nincompoop, which was apparently immensely worse. This was the epitome of their potential to insult each other. Things got better from there on out. Their viewpoints were disparate, Stubbs being the more educated and objective, Indian being a man of hearts. They agreed to disagree on most things. When things came to a boil, they sent for Ferdy or Prudence or Maud to intervene and act as tiebreaker. They could not be tried by a jury of their peers because most of their friends had passed on to Shut-Eye country. Stubbs' wife Donna was in Shut-Eye country. That's what Stubbs called it. Made him feel better than to admit that she had died. She had gone on about 13 years ahead. She had gone on ahead 13 years ago. They had been married for 16 years and he had been faithful to only her. The marriage had produced no children. They had both wanted children and grandchildren while they're at it, but Donna had been unable to produce babies. They had accepted it. They loved each other. They would be each other's child. Stubbs kept up his end of the deal with relish. Donna pampered and fussed over him. She stuffed him to the brim with more homemade cakes and pones than was warranted. She cooked as if she did have 3 children and 8 grandbabies who visited often, and she piled his plate with ground provisions, rice, meat, and gravy. His carrot juice had milk and sugar and was chock full of raisins, the way Stubbs liked it. The duo turned out to be equally astute, and the energy that would have gone into raising a family was channeled into building their business. Real estate. It started when Stubbs inherited some land in St. Thomas. Over time, he built a house and decided to rent it. The rent in St. Thomas compared to the city was meager, but it gave Stubbs an idea. They got a loan and bought some land in Kingston, where they lived at the time, and built a small apartment complex. It was a risk and a headache, and there were those who tried to intimidate them, but they refused to back down. Within a reasonably short time, they had developed 3 apartment complexes, plus the house in St. Thomas, and had moved into their dream home in Portmore just in time for Stubbs' diagnosis of diabetes. It knocked him for 6. It took him years to come to terms with it, and even longer before he could muster the courage to stick himself with a needle. Donna helped him. She always tried to hold back on the 3 square carb-packed meals each day, complete with snacks that Stubbs was accustomed to getting. Her husband resisted, to the point where the good-natured, sweet-tempered Donna started shouting at him. "Something is gonna take me home. Let me go home happy," he told her. In a mad rush to stave off gangrene, he lost his left leg. Then his right leg became sore and infected, and within 2 years, he lost that one too. Then he lost Donna. 16 years of marriage. He loved that woman. "She took it to heart," Stubbs told Indian. "She couldn't bear to see me suffer, but I suffered more since she left." A double amputee with insulin-dependent diabetes, confined to a wheelchair with no wife to comfort him, no children to love and shout after. All he had were his properties. At least he was a landlord. He had that. He had his dream home that he and Donna had made together. But who needed a big upstairs house when he couldn't even climb upstairs? He may be a landlord, but he was a lonely landlord. The leg stumps made him feel truncated and somehow less than whole. The loss of Donna made him feel the same. He cried in desperation every night. He was not a suicidal man, but on at least 2 occasions, he had tossed it up there among his list of options. He felt like the remnant of something that had started out complete but had been hacked. A plan aborted. He was smarter than the average bear, more broken than the average man. Stubbs rented out even the dream house, fully furnished. A family lived upstairs. After a while, he rented out even the downstairs portion and retreated into the quad. He was known as a philanthropist. He was a man who was always in an upbeat mood, laughing heartily, sometimes boisterously, always good solid advice to pass out. He had a kind heart and an indomitable spirit. It took some time for his own morale to catch up with the boost he gave to others. But by the by, he got there. Truth be told, Indian helped him make it there. The futility and irresolvable nature of their arguments gave him constant fodder to chew on each night and made him eager to wake up next morning to chew cud with Indian as they basked in the meadow. 3 women were knocking at the gate. They claimed that they were from Spanish Town. Their house had been burnt down with all their belongings, and they wanted to know if there were any old clothes that they could get. They had been walking from house to house and were tired. They rested on the steps in front of the veranda. "Didn't your house burn down last year? I remember giving you some clothes last year," said Stubbs. He stroked the cats in his lap. "House burned down again. Is Spanish Town we're talking about, Stubbs?" said Indian mischievously. The women stuck to their story, but the men knew the score. They did this every few months. The women would take the second-hand clothes and sell them downtown on Princess Street by the pound. They were fully aware that Portmore was the single largest market on the island for anything that needed to be peddled, be it goods, ideas, or hard luck stories, and they intended to milk it with a very straight face. "I put aside a bag of old clothes for you," Stubbs said, very businesslike. He had estimated there would have been at least 2 more fires this year. "Ferdy, fetch the big green garbage bag in my room, beside my bed in the corner." Ferdy returned with the bag. The women expressed their appreciation. They opened the bag and set to examining the contents, taking out each piece one by one and giving it a professional glance over as a way of appraisal. They pouted. They were not pleased with the offerings. "These pants so old and worn out," said one woman. "These t-shirts stretch out," said another. "Who buy these clothes? You people really don't have any taste," said the other. "You sound like you're shopping for a fashion show," Stubbs hissed. "Beggars can't be choosers. You want the clothes or not? Talk quick." One woman stomped off, insulted. The nerve of this old man, stopping them for this. The other two contemplated. They were making quick calculations to guess how much they could get for the junk, determine whether it was worth the haul. They decided to take a chance on it. "All right, thanks," one of them said, tugging the bag. "Next time, put some good clothes," said the other. "Put up some good clothes." "Next time, call the fire brigade, and move the candle from the curtain," shouted Stubbs. The two men roared in laughter. Stubbs laughed so heartily that his body shook. The cats had had enough of him. They meowed and leapt from his lap, if it could be called a lap. Indian had collapsed on the floor and was rolling in ecstasy. "Why you laughing at the poor woman?" asked Ferdy. "Fire burned down their house and you laughing at them?" The two men shook their heads. Rookie. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13. The back of the chair was turned towards the artists. Prudence sat facing them so that her legs straddled the chair the way one sits on a horse. Both feet were firmly planted on the ground. Her arms embraced the top of the wooden chair and her head rested on her arms. The gorgeous brown of the mahogany vied with the slightly lighter tone of her skin, contrasting and complementing. Her breasts played hide and seek with the alternating parallel bars of the back of the chair. Her meticulously shaved pubis rested delicately on the brown velvet. Mr. Willis was having an erection. He tried not to. He had instructed his male students not to. It was a thing much frowned upon in the profession. He was in principle against it. But Willis wanted this young woman. He wanted her. More than anything else, he wanted to taste her. He wanted to knead her flesh with his hands, like he was making dumplings for soup, a soup he would thoroughly enjoy. He wanted to pound her into submission. Willis gave his loins very firm instructions to quit the nonsense. His loins ignored him. He dared not move. He tried to look away. There were 17 students this morning, 10 females, 7 males. They were very focused and careful. They wanted to get it right. They wanted to do justice to the legs in particular. And the chair. The legs and the chair were their major concerns. Legs, a fetish in their own right, something to bring pleasure, something to stand on, something to walk away. People had legs, chairs had legs. Wood and skin had been thrust up against each other ever since the first man had encountered the first tree. This wood had been stained and polished. This skin had been washed and rubbed and lived in. Both had been prepared for the ritual of touch. The artist wanted to tell the story. It was well worth telling. Prudence found herself as much drawn to the art as she was to music. In the one, she was an active participant. In the other, she preferred to play a more passive role. Let the ones who had mastered the strokes execute them. She had mastered the pose and would provide them with something to execute. She did not envy the finesse of their stroke, the sharpness of their eyes. Her fingers were gifted with another kind of dexterity, and in her craft, her eyes were mainly closed. The music was dictated from within. She need only listen and follow. She had started modeling on a whim, agreeing to sit in for a friend who had been ill. She had thought nothing of it. Prudence had never had issues with her body. Since she was a little girl, she had enjoyed looking at her reflection in the mirror. There had never been a point where she had felt shame. It had always been amazement and wonder and pride. She never liked to conceal too much of her skin. She liked the feel of the sunshine on it. She liked the cool touch of the wind on it. People eavesdropped on the conversation between her clothes and her body. Some misunderstood it. Some felt the dialogue was too loud. Prudence treated the issue the way she treated pretty much everything in her life. She had very little diplomacy or tact. She said exactly what she meant, if she decided to say anything at all. She wore exactly what she wanted, if she decided to wear anything at all. She exercised no discretion because she didn't feel it was anyone's business. And modeling crept upon her and she sank into it. She enjoyed it. It enjoyed her. She was accused, even by few of the artists, of being unnecessarily provocative and uncouth, even vulgar, in her poses and postures. She also swore a lot, which strengthened their point. Some, of course, saw nothing wrong with swearing. Do you have a right to provoke me, and do I have a duty to resist? This question was asked of her, mainly by people who did not mind the provocation one bit and were not trying too hard to resist. At least, when you go to England, you'll have to cover up, they told her. No more Miss Tropical Paradise. Prudence had applied for acceptance into the Queen's Academy of Music in London. If she was offered a scholarship, she would study music there for 3 years, a more advanced honing process further along the road to stardom. Was that the ultimate end, to be a star, to earn millions? She knew it was not.